this lecture is to introduce you to the duty to learn about Indigenous legal orders and perspectives. You will learn about the origins of the Truth and Reconciliation Commission and the relevance of the calls to your legal education. The first part of this lecture will describe a brief history of intersocietal law and colonialism and settler colonialism in Canada. This history will take us to a discussion of the Indian Residential School Settlement Agreement, also known as IRSA. IRSA was an agreement between the First Nations survivors of residential schools and the Government of Canada. A key term of the IRSA was the establishment of the Truth and Reconciliation Commission. The second part of this lecture will describe the relevance of the Truth and Reconciliation Commission's calls to action for your legal education. Call to Action 28 calls upon all law students to learn about the history and legacy of Indian residential schools, the United Nations Declaration on the Rights of Indigenous Peoples, treaties and Aboriginal rights, Indigenous law, and Aboriginal-Crown relations. This lecture is not intended to teach you about these topics. These topics are intended to be integrated throughout your curriculum. In addition, the calls state that students should receive skills-based training in intercultural competency, conflict resolution, human rights, and anti-racism. We will define these concepts and describe their relevance to your legal education and practice. This lecture is only a survey. It has been written for two audiences. First, it has been written for an audience for whom this history and these concepts are unfamiliar. Second, it has been written for an audience for whom this history is personal and potentially traumatizing. As much as unfamiliar audiences should be challenged, these approaches can be inappropriate where the content is mandatory. We recommend that you continue to learn and commit to understanding the spirit of the calls. As you listen to this lecture, we encourage you to reflect on the statement, "We are all here to stay." This phrase was the closing line in Delgamuukw in British Columbia, written by then Chief Justice of the Supreme Court of Canada, Antonio Lamer. This phrase, "We are all here to stay," evokes certain assumptions about Canada, its future, and the place of Indigenous peoples. At the Canadian Institute for the Administration of Justice in 2015, Saskatoon Tribal Council Chief Felix Thomas challenged what it meant to be here to stay. Given the gross inequality between Indigenous and non-Indigenous peoples, here to stay meant here in jail. Harry Laforme, then a Justice of the Ontario Court of Appeal and a former Director of the Truth and Reconciliation Commission, put it another way. Justice Laforme told the audience of almost 100 legal professionals, many of whom were judges, "We are all here to stay, but not in the same way." What does this dialogue mean to you? What does it mean for you to be here to stay? What assumptions must be made for this to be true? If you are here to stay, what advantages or disadvantages do you have in that here-ness? What about for others to whom you have a relationship? What would it mean for you to be here to stay in a different way? This will be the question that we end this lecture with, so please take a moment to reflect. Before we get into the meat and potatoes of this lecture, we need to agree on some things to start. First, we need to agree on what we call ourselves and each other. Second, we need to agree on what it means to talk about Indigenous legal orders compared to Canadian Aboriginal law. Before we continue, we have to talk about how we refer to ourselves and each other. You will hear the word settler used in this lecture. A settler is a person who is not from a territory, but who comes to stay in that territory. Colonizers never have permission to stay in a territory. Their claim to stay cannot be legal under Indigenous law. You may also hear the language of whiteness used. When we talk about whiteness, we recognize that the process of racialization, of distinguishing between groups of individuals on the basis of race, is a social process that impacts all persons. Its unique effect for white persons is that it describes greater privileges, class, social, political, economic, and legal, than for other racialized persons. As Métis scholar Chelsea Vall tells us, the intent behind these terms is not to put us at odds, but to assist us in talking about a wider context than the first person and second person singular. The United Nations Declaration on the Rights of Indigenous Peoples uses the internationally accepted language of Indigenous peoples. The Constitution Act of 1982 uses the language of Aboriginal peoples, while the Federal Indian Act and the Constitution Act of 1867 uses the language of Indians. Both of these terms, Aboriginal peoples and Indians, have colonial or settler colonial origins and reflect the point of view of non-Indigenous governments. The Constitution Act of 1982 also further differentiates between the First Nations, Métis, and Inuit. You may have also heard other terms used, some of which are considered derogatory in some contexts. The legal term Indian, for example, is generally considered derogatory in almost all other social contexts. So how should you navigate between these concepts and definitions? The language you use depends on the legal and social context. There is no hard and fast rule. It is always recommended that you identify a person or community based on the term that they use to describe themselves. In some cases, a community may refer to itself several different ways. For example, it may refer to itself by its designation under the Indian Act as a band, or it may identify itself in its own language for its community. In other contexts, it may be necessary to use the term for the language group or subgroup, for a tribal council or political organization, for a local, clan, family, or other social unit. In legal contexts, terms may be used based on the statute or constitutional document, though sensitivity to social context remains important. Many law students misunderstand what Aboriginal law is. Aboriginal law refers to Canadian law that purports to apply to Indigenous persons or peoples in Canada. It is not limited to Indigenous peoples' constitutional rights. It touches almost every other aspect of law, from wills and estates, child and family, criminal, environmental, tax, tort, and contract. It is also primarily written from the perspective of settlers. To be clear, Aboriginal law is not Indigenous peoples' law. Indigenous legal orders refer to the law that is embedded in Indigenous social, political, economic, and spiritual institutions. Val Napoleon distinguishes Indigenous legal orders from legal systems centered around the state and that are managed by legal professionals in legal institutions that are separate from other social and political institutions. Indigenous legal orders are as diverse as there are nations. Like any other legal order, these traditions govern, regulate, or guide relationships. Having established some common language, we can now turn to Canada's colonial legacy and the Truth and Reconciliation Commission's calls to action for law schools. The Truth and Reconciliation Commission was established as a part of the settlement between the Government of Canada and the survivors of Indian residential schools. From the mid-1800s to the mid-1990s, the Government of Canada operated Indian residential schools throughout Canada. The original purpose of residential schools was to assimilate and enfranchise Indigenous children, to undermine Indigenous culture, law, and governance, and to pave the way for settlement. The Truth and Reconciliation Commission was established to memorialize and remember this history. The survivors gifted us with their experiences so that we may learn from the past. To understand the Truth and Reconciliation Commission's calls to action, we must reflect on the long history of Indigenous diplomacy and the colonial response. The history of Canada is rooted in this colonial response, a desire and force intended to dispossess Indigenous nations of their territories through the eradication of Indigenous societies and the displacement of Indigenous legal orders. Indian residential schools were only one policy and legal response intended to achieve this end. To understand the calls and our future, we must understand this history. Indigenous nations have governed their territories since time immemorial. When European colonialists and later settlers entered these territories, they did so according to the legal orders of these nations. The Treaty of Niagara is a pivotal moment in Canada's treaty history as well as a reflection of the strength of Indigenous nations. The Treaty of Niagara was a treaty between the British Crown, as represented by Sir William Johnston, the Superintendent of Indian Affairs for the colony, and Indigenous nations from across Canada. The treaty was entered into at Niagara Falls in 1764. The British Crown entered into the treaty in response to a massive show of force by the Ojibwa nations in the Great Lakes. This show of force was intended to remind the British Crown of the authority of the Indigenous nations in that territory. Prior to Britain's assertion of sovereignty, the French adhered strictly to the protocols of the Indigenous nations in the Great Lakes. The French purchased the permission of the Indigenous nations through the exchange of continual gifts. This permission authorized the use of the waterways and the establishment of forts for the purpose of trade. When France lost the 7 Years' War with Britain, it purported to cede its claims to its colonies in North America to Britain. Britain took a radically different approach to its relationship with Indigenous nations in the Great Lakes. It stopped its payments to the Indigenous nations. In 1761, General Amherst halted Britain's adherence to this protocol, arguing that Britain's greatness could not require it to pay for access to its own territories. This view was rebuffed forcefully by the Indigenous nations. In 1761, Chief Minavavana put this point to a renowned trader: "Englishmen, although you have conquered the French, you have not yet conquered us. We are not your slaves. These lakes, these woods and mountains were left to us by our ancestors. They are our inheritance, and we will part with them to none." In 1761, Pontiac, an Ojibwa war chief, coordinated a resistance in the Great Lakes, and by 1763 had ousted the British from almost all of their forts in the Great Lakes. Pontiac's resistance drew a strong response from the British Crown, the Royal Proclamation of 1763 and the Treaty of Niagara. The Royal Proclamation of 1763 was the first turn towards Britain's recognition of Indigenous diplomacy and law. The proclamation recognized the sovereignty of the Indian nations and established a procedure for Britain's purported acquisition of territories through consent and treaty. In the winter of 1763, it was printed and distributed through the Great Lakes, along with an invitation from Sir William Johnston for a meeting at Niagara to negotiate peace. Sir William Johnston was familiar with Indigenous diplomacy and law. He met the chiefs on mats and in front of fires at Niagara. The Indigenous nations exchanged wampum with Sir William Johnston, who entered into these treaties as the Crown's representative. For many years after, the treaty or treaties of Niagara were renewed through the giving of gifts by Sir William Johnston, and later his son. This was done according to Indigenous protocols, such as the exchange of gifts and the oral memorialization of the agreement. The Treaty of Niagara shows us that there has always been an opportunity for intersocietal law in Canada. Intersocietal law refers to the relationship between two different legal orders. These two orders meet within a shared space of understanding. This shared space requires respect for the other's authority and difference. We see how the British colony ignored, but then committed to, this intersocietal law. As we will see, Canada would come to neglect these commitments, going so far as to attempt to destroy the societies that gave life to these legal orders. By the mid-1800s, British colonial policy and law shifted harshly towards supremacy. In this period, British law and policy was heavily informed by theories of social Darwinism and white racial superiority. In a short period of time, colonial policy took an abrupt turn away from the recognition of Indigenous sovereignty towards a totalizing assertion of Crown sovereignty and the eradication of Indigenous legal orders and governance. Historian John S. Malloy argues that these shifts reflected a developmentalist logic, rooted in European ideas of civilization and Christianity. Indigenous peoples needed to be brought out of the so-called savagery and into the white European mode. The Indian residential schools was just one project intended to achieve this objective. Colonial law functioned to support and enable these policies. In 1857, the British colony enacted the Gradual Civilization Act. This act established a process for the enfranchisement and assimilation of Indigenous peoples. An enfranchised person gained the rights of a British citizen, but lost the rights in connection to their Indigenous nation or community. From a colonial perspective, Indigenous persons would remain backwards and unsophisticated as long as they were connected to their self-governing nations and communities. The intent was to sever this link between Indigenous nationhood and belonging. Upon Confederation, the Constitution Act of 1867 purported to assign the authority for the federal government to legislate with respect to Indians and lands reserved from them. From a settler colonial viewpoint, the Constitution authorized the federal government to legislate with respect to First Nations people. From this point onwards, the federal government could point to Canada's founding constitutional document as authority for its assimilatory policies and its control over Indigenous peoples' governance and lives. 2 years after Confederation, in 1869, the federal government continued the purposes of the Gradual Civilization Act in the Gradual Enfranchisement Act. 3 continuing trends can be seen in this legislation: the criminalization of Indigenous peoples, the undermining of Indigenous governance, and the assimilation of Indigenous persons by way of out-group marriage. In 1876, the federal government consolidated the pre-Confederation and post-Confederation legislation into the Indian Act. This act continued the developmentalist and assimilatory objectives of the prior acts and policies. Over the years, the act would criminalize the purchase of liquor, gambling, ceremony, traditional governance, and even the hiring of lawyers. From its very origins, the act was hostile towards traditional Indigenous governments and law. The act imposed an elected model of Indian bands and purported to restrict the nation's legislative authority to specific areas. The rules surrounding out-group marriage centered around the notion of status under the Indian Act. Status is a unique concept in Canadian law. It does not operate based on genetics or blood per se, nor on racial classifications. It is a distinctly technocratic concept that combines all of these ideas. Status under the Indian Act is a legal device used to restrict the federal government's responsibilities under Section 91(24) of the Constitution Act of 1867. If you recall, this section of the Constitution authorizes the government to legislate with respect to Indians. When legislation is enacted, certain obligations follow. Status narrows down the scope of those obligations. Most importantly, the Act placed the ultimate authority within the hands of the Superintendent of Indian Affairs. This Act, the Indian Act, remains in effect. More must be said about status because it is an important extension of the government's assimilatory objectives. Until very recently, the Indian Act status provisions discriminated completely against Indigenous women. At the time of its original enactment, a woman with status would become enfranchised, that is, she would lose her status, if she married a man without status. So too would her children lose status. However, a woman without status would gain status if she married a man with status. Status not only purported to narrow the government's obligations, but it also undermined governance by dividing and separating families from reserve land. We will see that Indian residential schools advance the same objectives as this colonial and settler colonial legislation. The colonial policy of residential schools has always been clear. In 1883, Prime Minister Sir John A. Macdonald told the House of Commons, When the school is on the reserve, the child lives with its parents, who are savages. He is surrounded by savages, and though he may learn to read and write, his habits, his training, and mode of thought are Indian. He is simply a savage who can read and write. It has been strongly pressed on myself, as the head of the department, that Indian children should be withdrawn as much as possible from the parental influence, and the only way to do that would be to put them in central training industrial schools, where they will acquire the habits and modes of thought of white men. In 1920, Indian Affairs Superintendent Duncan Campbell Scott reported to Parliament that our object is to continue until there is not a single Indian in Canada that has not been absorbed into the body politic. In 2015, the then Chief Justice of the Supreme Court of Canada, Beverly McLachlin, described this policy as cultural genocide. Cultural genocide is the destruction of those cultural structures and practices that allow a group to continue as a group. Indian residential schools were intended to destroy Indigenous societies through the assimilation of children. By destroying Indigenous societies, the federal government sought to solve its Indian problem, its chief barrier to the acquisition of land and resources. So too would it be able to unburden itself from its fiscal obligations by simply removing those, physically or legally, to whom it owed these obligations. The effects of Indian residential schools were destructive and long-lasting. In this story, responsibility is important. Children were physically, mentally, and sexually abused. Historian Ian Mosby documents how some schools conducted nutritional experiments on Indigenous children. We will likely never know exactly how many children died in residential schools because many records were lost, purposefully destroyed, or never even kept, as if all of this was an afterthought. In order to save costs, the federal government buried children two to a grave, or with only an unidentified white cross. Many children never returned to their communities. These were the effects of decisions made by the federal government and churches. Residential school-based intergenerational trauma continues to impact Indigenous families and communities. The children who survived residential schools return to their communities to become parents, teachers, and elders. However, the federal government's decision to maintain inequitable housing, water, education, healthcare, fire protection, and child welfare compounded this trauma, making it difficult for some survivors, their families, and their children and grandchildren to achieve an equitable standard of living. Even so, some advocated for their communities, rebuilding the resilience that the Crown intended to take from them. The effects of residential schools were the result of choices made by non-Indigenous governments, churches, and individuals. It is common for some settlers to perceive Indigenous persons as damaged, as inherently or racially inferior. Eve Tuck cautions us against this damage-centered narrative that abstracts Indigenous persons' socioeconomic inequality, stereotypically alcoholism, incarceration, and violence, from its settler colonial roots. This is what Eve Tuck describes as the settler move to innocence. Rather, as Tracy Lindbergh suggests, settlers must take responsibility, whether personal or through state representation, for the harms that resulted from their own choices and those of their representatives. She writes, "I think that there is a profound difference between inspiring guilt and requiring that people take responsibility for their actions and for perpetuating the actions initiated by their forefathers." She continues that settlers should act not out of curiosity for classroom purposes or to settle their fears, but because they respect Aboriginal people and accept that the responsibility for keeping Aboriginal peoples and issues alive is their concern as well. It is sometimes forgotten that the Indian Residential School Settlement Agreement originated from litigation brought by survivors, not the benevolence of the Canadian government. In 2005, Phil Fontaine, the former chief of the Assembly of First Nations and a residential school survivor himself, filed a class action against the Crown. Kathleen Mahoney, the chief negotiator for the Assembly of First Nations during the Indian Residential School Settlement, reports that thousands of survivors filed individual actions against the federal government and churches. As a result of their advocacy, the federal government engaged in the negotiation of the Residential Schools Settlement Agreement. Throughout this period, lawyers, negotiators, and judges struggled to understand survivors' legal claims and experiences. Government lawyers actively sought to stymie survivors' attempts at legal recovery for past and ongoing harms. Tort law, which governed the private actions, and civil procedure law were, at times, hostile to these claims. Procedural barriers such as Crown immunity clauses, which prevent persons from suing the Crown, and statutes of limitations made it difficult for survivors to pursue justice for older acts of violence. In some cases, the government and churches portrayed survivors as already or inevitably damaged, ignoring the fact that that damage was itself the result of colonialism. Even the lawyers of survivors failed sometimes to understand how the law functioned to deny their clients recovery. The legal process re-traumatized survivors and their families, some of them. Kathleen Mahoney describes how non-Indigenous lawyers in courts fail to understand the experiences of Indigenous survivors. The apparent failing on the part of the lawyers to properly serve their clients' needs can perhaps be explained by their legal education and the content of law school curricula. Other than the occasional elective course in feminist theory or critical race theory available at some law schools, the predominant theory taught in mainstream compulsory courses is liberal positivism, the colonial artifact that underpins the Western legal system. It assumes objectivity, equality, and neutrality for the colonizers without considering the values of the colonized. The deeply embedded assumption that colonial law was and is superior to the pre-existing Indigenous legal traditions is the overwhelming perspective that lawyers trained in the British legal traditions accept. Even though this approach is obviously biased to the benefit of colonizer interests, judges and lawyers unquestionably adopt it. In short, lawyers, negotiators, judges, and politicians were unable to understand the effects of Indian residential schools on Indigenous persons and on Indigenous governance, law, and culture. Moreover, these legal actors could not understand the experiences of these survivors and of what those survivors required for healing. In its final report, the Truth and Reconciliation Commission makes it abundantly clear that Indian residential schools operated pursuant to law, and also that the law, its culture and practice, could operate to sustain harm against survivors. The Truth and Reconciliation Commission explains, the criminal prosecution of abusers in residential schools and the subsequent civil lawsuits were a difficult experience for survivors. The courtroom experience was made worse by the fact that many lawyers did not have adequate cultural, historical, or psychological knowledge to deal with the painful memories that the survivors were forced to reveal. The lack of sensitivity that lawyers often demonstrated in dealing with residential school survivors resulted, in some cases, in the survivors not receiving appropriate legal service. These experiences prove the need for lawyers to develop a greater understanding of Aboriginal history and culture, as well as the multifaceted legacy of residential schools. The Truth and Reconciliation Commission identifies a need for all legal actors, lawyers, judges, and negotiators, to receive education in Indigenous legal orders and on the Canadian and international law that relates to Indigenous peoples. It also identifies the need for education on the history and legacy of residential schools. Finally, it identifies the need for certain skills and competency-based training, including intercultural competency, conflict resolution, human rights, and anti-racism. However, the Truth and Reconciliation Commission's calls is not the only place we can look to for why we must learn about Indigenous legal orders or Canadian Aboriginal law. All law students have a duty to learn Indigenous law. The late Justice Lance Finch, former Chief Justice of the British Columbia Court of Appeal, reasoned that the rule of law requires that all legal professionals learn about Indigenous legal orders. This is the why of Indigenous legal education. Justice Finch explains that the courts must necessarily be capable of understanding Indigenous law in order to articulate and guard the rights of Indigenous peoples. Courts must find space for the Canadian legal order within the pre-existing Indigenous legal landscape. This is what holds together the fabric of intersocietal law in Canada. We learn about Indigenous legal orders because they are a key thread in Canada's rule of law. As was described at the beginning of this lecture, intersocietal law governs Indigenous and non-Indigenous relations. Practicing intersocietal law requires understanding Indigenous and non-Indigenous legal orders and systems. Although many Indigenous persons know Canadian law, either through its imposition or through training as lawyers in the Canadian legal system, few settlers know Indigenous law. The practice of intersocietal law, which is fundamental to every settler's permission to stay, requires learning about Indigenous law. Next, we can look to the United Nations Declaration on the Rights of Indigenous Peoples. The declaration was the outcome of decades of Indigenous leadership and diplomacy. Although the declaration was ratified in 2007, Canada did not sign until 2016. Even today, the declaration remains marginalized. It has not been integrated into domestic law despite calls to do so, and the Supreme Court of Canada has not yet relied on it, even as guidance. Article 3 of UNDRIP provides that Indigenous peoples have the right to freely determine their political status and freely pursue their economic, social, and cultural development. The right to practice and transmit Indigenous legal orders is a necessary component of this right. Practicing law, whether Canadian or Indigenous, in Canada, requires learning about Indigenous legal orders. Canadian constitutional law requires that all lawyers and judges receive education in Indigenous legal orders. Aboriginal people's rights under Section 35 of the Constitution Act of 1982 are sui generis. To interpret these rights, courts must consider Indigenous perspectives, including the Indigenous legal perspective. In addition, Indigenous perspectives are relevant to the interpretation of some statutes, which purport to apply to Indigenous persons and communities. As future lawyers and judges in waiting, all law students must receive education in Indigenous legal orders in order to meaningfully interpret these constitutional and statutory rights under Canadian law. Trevor Farrow argues that we must rework our codes of conduct and professionalism to reflect legal pluralism, diversity, access to justice, truth, dignity, and respect. Nicholas Healy proposes that the professional standard of civility requires that all lawyers not only learn about Indigenous legal orders and cultural competency, but also internalize that education and training. Healy writes, "Reconciliation becomes something that the lawyer must perform through her body." Finally, all law students must learn Indigenous law because it lives in Indigenous communities. Indigenous peoples continue to live by their own laws and governance systems. Regardless of whether a student intends to practice in an Indigenous community, it could be argued that it is their responsibility as settlers to understand something about the laws that continue to apply in Indigenous territories. To put simply, we must learn Indigenous law because Canadian constitutional law requires it, and because Indigenous law lives in Canada. Indigenous law cannot be learned or practiced the same way as Canadian law. Although Indigenous law can be approached from a case study method, for example, John Burroughs argues that Indigenous law is better understood through distinctly Indigenous categories, rather than through analogy with the common law, although it can be done. Aaron Mills argues that Indigenous legal orders must be understood in the context of Indigenous peoples' distinct lifeways, the ecosystem of Indigenous law, that is, Indigenous epistemologies, cosmologies, and ontologies. As Val Napoleon and Hadley Friedland note, we've come a long way from the why of Indigenous legal education to the how of it. It is not as simple as just learning the content of Indigenous legal orders. Justice Finch supports the insights of Tracy Lindbergh, James Saketch Henderson, and Aaron Mills when he explains that more is required. Canadian law needs to be ready to understand Indigenous legal orders. Justice Finch puts it this way: ability is a precondition to application. Before space can be made in the Canadian legal landscape for Indigenous law, the participants in the process, judges, lawyers, and lawmakers, as well as academics, must be able to conceptualize and recognize what they are making space for, or the exercise will be futile. A profound change in perspective is needed. For this sort of profound perspective change, Neheo scholar Willie Ermine offers the idea of an ethical space of an engagement. This space is a theater for cross-cultural conversation in pursuit of ethically engaging diversity and dispersed claims to the human order. Engagement at the ethical space triggers a dialogue that begins to set the parameters for an agreement to interact, modeled on appropriate, ethical, human principles. Dialogue is concerned with providing space for exploring fields of thought, and attention is given to understanding how thought functions in governing our behaviors. It is a way of observing collectively how hidden values and interactions can control our behavior, and how unnoticed cultural differences can clash without our realizing what is occurring. The path towards an ethical space of engagement requires that non-Indigenous peoples work through a series of complex, deeply personal processes. They must turn their gaze inward. In short, settlers must consider how their beliefs, attitudes, and behaviors reinforce settler colonialism and exclude Indigenous legal orders. Thus, as much as law students should learn about Indigenous law, they must learn about Canadian Aboriginal law. Law students, as judges in waiting, must be able to deconstruct Canadian law's imperial and totalizing supremacy in order to make space to ethically engage with Indigenous legal orders. Canadian Aboriginal law purports to govern many aspects of Indigenous persons and people's lives. The Indian Act, for example, is said to rule from cradle to grave. Canadian constitutional law about Aboriginal rights and title has been fashioned to achieve certain state objectives, such as securing and developing resources. Whether intentional or not, Aboriginal rights and title have been limited through legal argumentation and judicial interpretation. To deconstruct Aboriginal law, law students must receive critical education in this area. Tracy Lindbergh argues that we need to examine white supremacy because the impact and the entrenchment of that supremacy are so ingrained in the language of Canadian law that we may not even see it. She continues, in this carefully woven braid of rejuvenation, reclamation, and rebuilding of Indigenous law, we have to make sure we identify the rot that has infected and affected the ancient fibers. Put simply, law students mislead themselves when they take Canadian Aboriginal law as authoritative. While it is also clear that more is needed, what is also clear is that more is needed than just doctrinal legal education. Law students must have the opportunity to develop relational skills. These skills are necessary for practicing Canadian Aboriginal law, and they can be applied to any other area of law. We will now turn to some of these relational skills and what they mean for your professional legal education. Today, the concept of cultural competency is popular in legal practice. The University of British Columbia offers a certificate in Indigenous cultural competency. SANIAS, an Indigenous cultural competency program originally developed for healthcare practitioners in British Columbia, has been modified for training Crown lawyers. The Advocate Society of Ontario and Aboriginal Legal Services in Toronto have each released guides based on cultural competency concepts. Cultural competency is a broad, multidisciplinary concept that describes the ability to understand and communicate across cultures. The term was first introduced in the healthcare context by Terry Cross in the late 1980s. The field has opened to a variety of other forms, including cultural awareness, cultural competency, intercultural competency, cultural sensitivity, cultural safety, and cultural humility. Each of these terms means something slightly different. Earlier approaches to cultural competence focused on cultural knowledge, particularly visible or audible aspects of culture such as dress or speech or music. Custom, beliefs, and values were also considered. These approaches were often focused on external group differences and were oriented towards reducing intergroup conflict. In the healthcare context, these approaches were intended to ensure the compliance of patients from other cultures. In Aboriginal law, we see this focus on cultural difference in cases on the Section 35 rights and title of Aboriginal peoples. It is said to be what distinguishes Aboriginal rights from the rights of non-Indigenous persons under the Charter of Rights and Freedoms. This focus on cultural difference, rather than legal, spiritual, and political difference, is limiting. Today, cultural competency is understood to be a lifelong process that requires introspection and self-awareness. Unlike earlier manifestations, contemporary theories are inward-looking. They ask individuals to consider the hidden assumptions, values, behaviors, and interpretations generated from within their own cultural framework or worldview. However, there are strong critiques against the focus on cultural competency. Christine Zuni-Cruz states, "I specifically reject the term cultural competency because I do not believe outsiders to Indigenous cultures can become competent in an Indigenous culture. There are too many aspects of Indigenous knowledge that are not accessible to outsiders of the culture, even to those outsiders who spend their lives studying the culture. Competency assumes a level of understanding that I believe is attainable only by insiders to a culture. Additionally, cultural competency imparts an understanding of another's culture that borders on arrogance." Nicholas Healy similarly questions the current focus on cultural competency. Healy suggests that if cultural competency is treated merely as an educational requirement rather than as an ethical obligation, lawyers may be insulated from discipline and clients may be harmed. Already, some lawyers claim to be culturally competent to provide services to Indigenous nations simply because they have received training. Instead, Healy suggests that cultural competency be tied to the ethical standard of civility. Healy explains that cultural competence, when attached to civility, will not only demand an ethical knowledge about Indigenous cultures, but an ethical knowledge in engaging with Indigenous cultures. Pooja Parmar is similarly critical of the current focus on cultural competency. The focus on cultural competency ignores Indigenous peoples' legal, political, and spiritual differences. A myopic focus on cultural difference may blind lawyers to their clients' legal experiences and needs. Parmar writes, "Understanding a lawyer-client encounter only as one between law and culture replicates colonial violence. Instead, lawyers need to become familiar with colonial histories that document how colonial logic shaped the idea that some people have culture while others have law, and that created hierarchies placing Indigenous peoples' knowledge, governance systems, economies, laws, and epistemologies at the bottom of those hierarchies everywhere. Parmar concludes that legal competence requires that all legal professionals have the knowledge and skills which allow them to understand when it is necessary to draw on Indigenous laws in order to represent or respond to an Indigenous claim. Cultural safety is a concept that may assist us in understanding the harms caused to Indigenous clients by incompetent services. The First Nations Health Authority defines cultural safety as an outcome based on respectful engagement that recognizes and strives to address power imbalances inherent in the healthcare system. It results in an environment free of racism and discrimination, where people feel safe when receiving healthcare. Generally, the successes of cultural competency training are evaluated based on changes in the professional's values or beliefs, that is, their knowledge. The success of cultural safety, however, is evaluated based on the client's subjective feeling of safety, of being heard. We can extend this concept to legal practice when we ask whether our legal clients have received competent legal advice. Competent legal advice requires that lawyers are sensitive to their clients' experiences and perspectives. The client's feeling of safety is an indicator of this competence. It is a prerequisite, in my view, to competent legal services. Cultural humility is another concept that is relevant to legal practice. The First Nations Health Authority defines cultural humility as a process of self-reflection to understand personal and systemic biases and to develop and maintain respectful processes and relationships based on mutual trust. Cultural humility involves humbly acknowledging oneself as a learner when it comes to understanding another's experience. Lindsay Burrows describes the Anishinaabe legal principle of humility. She argues that humility is a state of being that can open hearts and minds to see a situation in different ways, and one that fosters a view of equality that has the power to usher in the light of a new day. She adds that humility is not about viewing oneself as being above or below another. It is instead seeing all life as equally deserving of respect. Space must be taken up as necessary, just as much as it must be given away at times as well. Humility in this sense is an ongoing, reflexive process of being open to new perspectives, and it cannot be measured. Lindsay Burrows writes, if legal actors practiced humility in a more rigorous way, the legal system could be more open to positive change. Failures might be seen as an opportunity to try again, instead of leading to cynicism that often accompanies failed decisions. In law school, students might have lower levels of depression and substance abuse if humility were fostered as an important aspect of their learning as reflected in the law itself. When these students become decision makers in various capacities, this humility would be more likely to carry forward and allow for a more adaptable, teachable, open, down-to-earth, and measured legal system. Hopefully, legal actors would see themselves as lifelong students as they continually interact with new people and new situations in their work and personal lives. The varying legal orders in Canada could interact less destructively and instead learn from the strengths of others to replace their own weaknesses. For Indigenous students and professors, learning Canadian law is a deeply unsettling experience. Tracy Lindbergh turns the tables around when she charges non-Indigenous settler students with approaching their own discomfort. We have accepted the responsibility of educating ourselves. We have risen to the challenge of remaining Aboriginal in the search for knowledge in a system that challenges our makeup. We respect the wisdom that we have gained. We honor the teachers who have tried to change a vision of their world in order to include other worlds. We have found ourselves immersed in a value system that is strange and foreign to many of us. We have struggled academically, personally, and in innumerable other ways to include, or at least respect your vision of the world. It is your turn. Settlers must take responsibility for their feelings of discomfort and unsettlement. Lindsay Burrows explains that Law is a site of discomfort. It places diverse peoples together in complicated situations. It challenges us to step outside of ourselves and consider new ways of being. Lindsay Burrows invites us to reflect for a moment on a time when you too were completely out of your comfort zone. How did you arrive at that uncomfortable place? What made it so uncomfortable? What did you do to adapt or adjust? How did it shape who you are today? There is also a need to include not only Indigenous perspectives and legal orders in legal education, but also to meaningfully include Indigenous students and professors in these processes. Some universities propose a process of indigenization, which is sometimes defined as the inclusion of Indigenous perspectives and persons within the existing institution. Eve Tuck and K.W. Wang warned that indigenization may operate as enclosure rather than inclusion, marginalizing Indigenous persons and perspectives within the institution and curriculum. But there is a clear need to ensure that Indigenous students, professors, and communities are meaningfully included. Constance Backhouse documents how the Indian Act prohibited persons with Indian status from receiving a legal education, and how Law Society's professional standards effectively excluded Indigenous persons from legal practice. Despite almost 4 decades of attempts to include Indigenous persons in legal education, Indigenous persons remain underrepresented at the higher levels of the profession. In 2020, only 11 out of 203 partners in the top Lexpert-ranked firms for Aboriginal law were publicly identified as Indigenous. Inclusion, however, is not enough. Canadian law continues to exclude Indigenous persons' unique legal perspectives. The Truth and Reconciliation Commission's calls to action are oriented towards reconciliation. Settler interpretations of reconciliation, however, tend to ensure a measure of control and stability. Eve Tuck and K.W. Yang call this settler futurity. It is the belief that we are all here to stay in the same way. Jeffrey Dennis and Carrie Bailey observed that non-Indigenous TRC volunteers often defined reconciliation as disconnected from decolonization and from Indigenous peoples' relationship to land. They found that although many participants supported education about the history of colonization, only half accepted that this required self-reflection and personal responsibility. Although half supported some change, almost all were vague on the specifics. Many supported an integrationist philosophy. They believed that Indigenous persons must work with Canada, get on board the proverbial canoe, not look back and paddle forward together. This is a comforting thought to settlers. We can place the TRC's calls in the context of 2 related processes: settler harm reduction and decolonization. A settler harm reduction approach raises the critical consciousness of settlers. Eve Tuck and K.W. Yang tell us that this approach is crucial in the resuscitation of practices and intellectual life outside of settler ontologies. It seeks to alleviate the consequences of white supremacy and colonialism by treating their symptoms as historical inequities to be mitigated. Harm reduction approaches aim to create safe spaces where Indigenous peoples and their lifeways are safer from the effects of settler colonialism and racial stereotyping and prejudice. Settler harm reduction is only the start of a much longer, intensive process towards decolonization. So what does this look like in practice? A settler harm reduction approach requires settlers to moderate or regulate their behaviors, attitudes, and beliefs in order to reduce harm to their Indigenous peers. It requires that settlers are accountable and responsible for the harms caused by their choices. Settlers may, for example, ensure that they respect Indigenous spaces and agency. This includes respecting the choice of Indigenous persons not to engage with settler colonial law or practices. An Indigenous student group might hold an event for their community members, and unless invited, A settler harm reduction approach may suggest that a settler respect this restriction and not attend. Settlers may also take personal accountability and responsibility for their choices. They may, for example, commit to learning about settler colonialism and Indigenous legal orders. This would require them to read or view materials created by Indigenous persons and communities. In short, it requires that they consider the Indigenous worldview and make space for it. In an educational context, it also requires that settlers recognize and respect Indigenous peoples' legal orders and perspectives. This may sound straightforward, but it is more complicated in practice. Tracy Lindbergh reflects on how Indigenous students have to learn the law 3 times, once to understand it, once to deconstruct it, and once to consider the Indigenous legal perspective. Mary Batiste calls this the cognitive imperialism of education. Like a fast-moving current, it keeps everything in its undertow. These are the harmful effects of the settler colonial assumptions that we make about legal education. Without settler harm reduction, the mainstream current in Canadian legal education will continue to segregate Indigenous legal orders and perspectives, or make them subject to non-Indigenous ways of understanding. In the immediate period, then, this is the responsibility of settler law students. Do no harm. Ultimately, decolonization is necessary for settler institutions to respect and incorporate Indigenous legal orders. Eve Tuck and K.W. Yang define decolonization as the repatriation of Indigenous land and life and the transformation of Indigenous and non-Indigenous peoples' relationship outside of settler colonialism. For Geoffrey Hewitt, decolonization in Canadian legal education is the complicated work of acknowledging historic and ongoing wrongdoings, along with claiming responsibility through naming, dismantling, countering, and neutralizing both the collective and individual assertions and assumptions made in relation to Indigenous peoples. I define decolonization as the dismantling of racial and settler colonial hierarchies embedded in the rule of law. Thus, regardless of which definition one uses, this is more than just settler harm reduction. It is a process of actively deconstructing and dismantling the cognitive imperialism of Canadian legal education. You will learn about Indigenous legal orders in your courses at law school. Some professors may use the case brief method to draw out law from Indigenous stories. Others may immerse your education in Indigenous contexts through observation, listening, play, and co-learning. There is not one way to learn about Indigenous legal orders. However, as you proceed through your education, reflect on what it means to be here to stay. Challenge the assumptions hidden in Canadian law and embrace discomfort. Be open to unsettlement. Consider the past as well as the future. What does it mean for you to be here to stay, but not in the same way?